Elliot and Sasha would come to the office at the end of the day where they worked at Vibe and The Source respectively. And,
Right.
I would get to sit and watch these five guys sit around one computer with Chairman Mao as the hands behind the keyboard. And they would come up with these charts or write Ted Bono's editorial, the Teditorial, or Galen Bono's column, or the Ego Trip Fiction. I imagine it is probably what like being in the SNL writers' room in 1977 was like.
First I say, what we're going to do. Then you say, I don't know, what do you want to do? Well, we're going to do what you want to do.
I have an idea.
You're going to dig this.
The Fly Fidelity Podcast
Is the solution. It's the best.
Check it out.
You want to get super fly.
Details just ahead.
Do you love credible content, but hate
how long you have to wait?
and who wants
super thick and frothy dumpster juice with rat corpses in it?
There's a better way.
Fly Fidelity.
Fly Fidelity.
Fly Fidelity. Fly Fidelity.
Fly Fidelity.
Fidelity. Fly Fidelity Podcast.
Fly Fidelity, baby. Fidelity, baby. Fidelity.
With your host, Luke Bailey.
Welcome to the program. On this season premiere, we're featuring part one of a two-part conversation with founder and host of Idea Generation, Noah Callahan-Bever, journalist, writer, editor, A&R, music executive, elite content creator. We discuss and dissect his extraordinary journey so far, from his humble beginnings working in print media to defining Complex, to becoming head executive of Def Jam, to his latest and greatest project yet, Idea Generation.
As a young music journalist, my goal was to understand how musicians made their creative decisions. But as I moved up the masthead, from reviews to cover stories, from editing sections to editing a portfolio of properties, my interest evolved. Now I wanted to know how the creators I covered thought about things like innovation, strategy, and management. And the more that I pulled at these threads, the more that the audience responded. So I partnered with Trisha Clark Stone and Helena Ox, and together the three of us created Idea Generation. A 360 media platform, Idea Generation exists to educate and inspire the creative entrepreneurs of tomorrow. And in no coincidence, the brand about creative entrepreneurship is itself an exercise in creative entrepreneurship. So here we are launching our first of many products, an interview show exploring the intersection of art and commerce. If you've ever had a big idea or dreamed of building a business on the back of your creativity, please tune in and join us on this ride. Welcome to Idea Generation.
What was it, who was it, that drew you into hip-hop, and how did those formative years of being a fan in the beginning amplify your identity?
Well, I was born in 1979, which is, to some people, the year that the first hip hop record came out. If you're counting Rapper's Delight. But so, I think that in a lot of ways, timing had a lot to do with it. And then I think also sort of like geolocation was a huge part of it. I grew up in New York City in the early 80s. And I think the combination of just sort of like coming into my own consciousness at the same time that hip hop is exploding, it sort of was just this ubiquitous sound that I really associated with, the place that I was living. And, I moved to the city when I was 5 years old 5 years old. So it was kind of like a new and fresh thing that I was being exposed to right at the moment that hip hop was really making huge strides towards, crossing over into sort of mainstream consciousness. And so, it's hard for me to put a finger on an exact moment that I became aware of hip hop, but I would say the first, I can specifically remember getting ready for school. My mom used to listen to pop radio, WPLJ, and we were like in the bathroom and she's getting ready for work and I'm like, brushing my hair and stuff. And Fight for Your Right to Party came on the morning, countdown or whatever it was on WPLJ. This is in like 1986. And being really drawn to the energy of it. And then shortly thereafter, a very close friend of mine, his older sister, Alicia, was, probably like 14 or 15 and going out to clubs like Limelight and Palladium and stuff like that, even as a very young kid in New York. And she gave us, I think it was like a 120-minute cassette, which had on one side License to Ill and on another side Criminal Minded. And Kenny Birch and I would just like listen to these endlessly and memorize the words. And his family had like a VHS recorder. And so we would get Alicia to shoot sort of music videos of us, lip syncing to like Criminal Minded or No Sleep Till Brooklyn. Yeah, the funny thing was that we had no idea that these were like two separate groups or that there was any different that one had one MC versus the other having three MCs. To us, it was just like, this is the most exciting thing in the world. I don't, and it's really just about being drawn to an energy.
Criminal minded, you've been blinded. Looking for a style like mine, you can't find it. They are the audience, I am the lyricist. Sometimes the suckers on the side gotta hear this pain, a rage, yet I'm not in a cage. Free as a bird to fly about on stage. Ain't here for no frontin', just to say a little something. Your suckers don't like me cause you're all about nothing. However, I'm really fascinating to the letter. My all-around performance gets better and better. My English grammar comes down like a hammer. You need style, I need to pull your bar. I don't beg favors, you're kissing other people's. I write and produce myself just as fast. Keep my hair like this. Got no time for jerry curls. Attracting only women. Got no time for little girls. Cause girls look so good, but their brain is not ready. I don't know. I'd rather talk to a woman. Cause her mind is so steady. So here we go.
Coming to New York, I had grown up, my parents met and, sort of my formative years took place in Princeton, New Jersey, which is, small suburban town in South Jersey. And after my parents split, my mom moved to the city and I moved with her. And we lived in Lower Manhattan. And, the sounds and the sights of hip hop were really just sort of omnipresent. It was the music that you heard coming out of every car. Back in those days, you could even see people like breakdancing on cardboard boxes on the street. Like, I know it sounds like something out of like Beat Street or something, but that actually was something that would happen in Tribeca or Soho, obviously as something of a novelty. At that point, you would see, obviously beautiful whole cars were, not a dime a dozen, but you saw an epic amount of tags and throw ups and all kinds of graffiti everywhere. And, it just became sort of like the aesthetic language of the city in my mind. And so, once I started to sort of become more and more interested in music, this became sort of like the de facto, most interesting thing going on, really.
Coming from an era where some of your earliest dedication about rap music was being shaped by way of tape trading, what would have been some of the earliest albums that define your taste as a fan during that period?
I mean, okay, so definitely Mama Said Knock You Out and Nation of Millions and Fear of a Black Planet were extremely consequential to me in that 89 90 period, which is really when I started, like, before that we had this Beasties Boogie Down production tape, and then after that I was sort of aware of the kind of pop stuff, Tone Loc, Rob Bass, obviously, and then really some like hair metal that was on the radio or on MTV at the time, Guns N' Roses and that kind of stuff. And in that sort of elementary school period, I don't think I really had much understanding of what was going on. And then around 4th, 5th grade, like I said, like 89, 90 was when I started really to like acquire music on my own and of my own volition. And those 3 records were really big for me. There was something about Public Enemy that I just found so urgent and just so compelling. Chuck's voice was unbelievable. And the things that he was saying, I didn't fully understand them, but I could tell that they were important. And I was just drawn into them. And then from there, me and my friends, as we sort of started to, decode the contextual scene of hip hop and like what was going on and what was important, because, we're little kids and there's not much in terms of media, around hip hop in general, and particularly not for like elementary school kids. Then we went into the native tongues, and that was where I really sort of, fell down the rabbit hole.
So much of that era really depended on you buying a record by way of what that record looked like visually. And I was curious as to, as a illustrator back then, as a graffiti writer back then, what was the moment that you realized that the cover art was, and still is, in some cases, more important than the album was itself?
Well, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't go as far as calling myself a graffiti writer. I was a toy, terrible graffiti writer, but I had grown up obsessed with comic books. And for really that, that period of kindergarten through, say, like fifth grade, I was the kid that just went to the comic shop every single day after school and just hung out and read issues that, I could never buy, and just sort of got obsessed with the details of this, these sort of shared universes in Marvel and DC. And, I was the kid that would read the Who's Who and the Marvel Universe Index and all of that kind of stuff, and really try to put together this sort of tapestry of characters and understand how they all fit together. And I think that was a lot of what appealed to me about hip hop as well, was that as soon as I started to sort of learn about it, I started to realize that there was this larger shared universe, and that, the artists would thank each other, and they had these relationships where certain people would do, would work, make beats for each other. And all of these things were like, it was like, again, decoding these sort of levels of connection that were not abundantly obvious, and sort of putting together this universe in my own head. But to answer your question about the covers, of course, as a comic enthusiast, you pick up a comic because you see the cover and then you flip through it. And one of the sleights of hand that the comic companies, of course, do is getting a different artist to do the cover than the inside. But I wasn't really savvy to that at 11 years old. But as I started to get, a few rap albums, and at this point, things that myself and my friends were into, it was really like a cousin co-signs it, or someone's older sibling co-signs it, and then you sort of have this cornerstone that you're building from. And then we would just go into Sam Goody and just look at the racks and flip through the cassettes, and you would see something like the 30 PMD album, which as a comic book fan, instantly I connected with, Daredevil, Frank Miller, and, obviously Bill Sienkiewicz was one of the most consequential late 80s Marvel artists, of all time. Anyway, and so, we would just dig through the covers, and you'd look for something that was striking or looked interesting. And, and then you'd get the album, get it home. Me and my friends had a very rigorous system of sort of apprising the value of records, in so much as, like, one person would buy it, everybody else would make a dub of it. And if the record was really great, then you would go buy it yourself, because, anyone who has ever dealt with cassettes knows that the dub recording is never as loud or as crisp as the original one, straight from the manufacturer. And so we would just go in there and try to find tapes that looked, interesting, and then you would just pour through the liner notes and sort of try to figure out, who is this group, or who is this artist, and what is their connection, where are they from, and who else do they know. And I will say that the thank yous were instrumental in helping us try to put that together. But in an era where, Video Music Box was not yet on our radar, Hot 97 was still a dance format station. Yo MTV Raps was only on once a week. and I don't know if the source was either barely available, but it was certainly not on our radar. We were just kind of like trying to figure out again, who are all these characters in this shared universe and what is their relationship to each other, and with the idea that somehow if we could decode this, we would find the absolute best music.
You mentioned the word universe a couple of minutes ago, and I want to talk about this universe more, about you growing up. Can you talk about your relationship with 42nd Street as a starting point, forging a career path, but also 42nd Street, for better or for worse, as the story of America in the 20th century?
Yeah, I mean, 42nd Street is a New York icon. And you have to imagine coming to New York in 85, 84 years, it's at a sort of low point in the trajectory of the square, not perhaps not culturally, but in terms of infrastructure and just like what's going on. It was a very sort of seedy place with a lot of like peep show booths and B movie theaters and kids, teenagers running around doing the kind of derelict shit that teenagers do when there's no oversight from adults. And so when I got there as a kid, it was definitely sort of both quintessentially New York and iconic, but also something that I understood to have a sense of danger. And anyone who's watched any 80s comedies understands that the sort of general impression in the world of New York at that point was one of imminent danger and all constant like sketchy things going on. The reality, I think, was not as much that as what necessarily got broadcast, and certainly wasn't my experience. Just being a kid running around New York City by myself. But yeah, and then Times Square would end up being really pivotal for me. Two of my most important work experiences would happen there. When I was 16, I would get an internship at Nervous Records, which was a small dance label that had signed Black Moon and Smith & Wesson and was really sort of the incubator of the boot camp clique. And then a few years later, I would end up working at MTV, kind of at the height of TRL madness, when kids would line up around the block and, stand their favorite artists from the little square in the middle of Times Square. So Carson Daly and the artist could see them out the window.
Right.
And it was interesting because both of those experiences did happen kind of like as Times Square, was going through this evolution. By the time I was there in the spring of '96, Giuliani was in office, and there was the Disneyfication of Times Square had just sort of started, and they had just pushed a lot of the peep show booths and a lot of the sketchier stuff that had dominated that part of town in the '80s to the periphery. And you were starting to get, the Hard Rock Cafe and more kind of like middle of America tourist trap things. And then by the time I was there in 2000, when I worked at MTV, it was very squeaky clean. And, it's funny as a New Yorker, because I think about Times Square a lot. It's like one of those places that, I can go sometimes 5 years at a time without ever walking through there. But then I've had moments in my life, like when I worked at MTV, where I was there absolutely every single day for, 2 years. So it's an interesting place.
What about your place at Nervous? What were your duties? What was it you were hired to do?
Well, hired might be overstating the relationship, but I would show up after school and I would basically just cut stickers and call record stores. This was a time, where there's very little data for record labels in terms of, what is moving. And one of the key ways that, A&Rs, promotion people, and I guess the bosses at the labels would find out what was sort of moving the needle outside of looking in Billboard was to just have kids call stores around the country and get, on the ground feedback from people about like what records people are talking about, and what is flying off the shelves and what's sitting, and just sort of get a local vibe, because at that time it was so hard to get a sense of what was going on outside of your own sort of like local market.
After that, you end up by chance in a similar situation, interning at Priority. What type of people used to come in and out of the office at that time?
So the relationship between Nervous and Priority was interesting. I was an intern at Nervous doing kind of all of these menial chores over there. And one day, who walks in but Buckshot and Druha. And at the time, I sort of vaguely knew that Bootcamp Click was changing their label situation. There had been some ads in the source for the Fab Five, and which had Priority logos on it. But I didn't really understand what exactly that meant because I'm 16 years old, and no one in the office is really talking about anything, or framing the relationship in any way for me. But it was very abundantly clear from both gentlemen's body language that they were not happy with the relationship that they had with, I believe his name is Mike Weiss, the owner of Nervous. And I just remember them storming in very, very upset and kind of slamming the door to go into his office. And then there's about 15 to 20 minutes of heated exchange coming through the walls. And I'm sort of sitting there nervously, no pun intended, kind of trying to figure out what to do. And my boss, Chris, at the time, was like, man, you should probably break out. I think I don't really know what's going to happen next. And so I grabbed my backpack and I said goodbye to him. And I walk out to the elevator to head back home. And, Nervous was in this giant pre-war office building that probably had like 40 floors, and they were up on 30 something floor. And it had like 3 elevators. So typically if you hit the button, you might have to wait like somewhere between like 5 and 10 minutes for the elevator to finally come. So I'm sitting there listening to my headphones, just like waiting for the elevator. And who comes around the corner but Buckshot and Druha? And Buckshot makes eye contact with me and is like, yo, were you just in the Nervous office? And I was like, yeah, I'm an intern. I was, yeah, I'm a big fan of Black Moon, man. You guys are ill, or something along those lines. And he's like, yo, Drew, do you have an extra one of those t-shirts? And I'm like, Drew Hobb reaches in his bag and pulls out a brown Bootcamp Click shirt, which I guess is like the promo tee for the group album that they were, I guess, at the very earliest stages of working on. Right. And he's like, yo, do me a favor. I want you to wear that every time you go up in that office. And I'm like, all right. And I like hold on to the tee and we like get on the elevator and go down, and I'm sort of, and he's also like talking shit about, I mean, obviously whatever meeting they had did not go well. And he was very upset about it. And so I'm just standing there awkwardly, trying to look like I'm not listening, but obviously listening. Yeah. And, about, I don't know, maybe 6 weeks later, I'm walking down 18th Street and I'm wearing this Bootcamp Click shirt because, of course, this is now my new favorite t-shirt. And I run into a gentleman named James Azor, who was in promotion at Priority at the time. And he asks me, yo, where'd you get that t-shirt? And I didn't really put it together, but, there probably were like 150 of these made or something along those lines. And I explained the situation. He's like, oh, man, well, fuck Nervous. Like, yo, you should come be an intern at Priority. And I was like, all right. And so then that summer of 96, I ended up going and being an intern there. And in terms of job responsibilities, it was all basically exactly the same. Cutting
Right.
stickers, calling radio stations, calling record stores, writing down, jotting down notes, telling James what's moving at, these local college radios, what's moving in these, regional record stores, up and down the East Coast. And then occasionally, doing stuff like going to the Palladium and passing out flyers, for whatever. They had some group called The Truth, I think that was a R&B group that they were putting out. And the highlight of
Interesting.
was that, every now and again, like Helter Skelter or Organized Confusion would like pass through the office, and I'd get to see them. And maybe I would get a fist bump and an acknowledgement or whatever, which at 16 was
That's
pretty much,
everything.
yeah. I run back to my friends and tell everybody about it.
Seeing and experiencing all of that happen at that age, 17, 18 years old, what kind of impact do those experiences have on forging a meaning and turning your passion into purpose moving forward?
Well, I mean, I think to sort of understand where I was coming from, I have to explain that my dad made computer games when I was a kid. And so I grew up watching him both, take ideas out of his head and turn them into these entertainment products. And then I also got to see him interact with people who were impacted by them. I'd go to like gaming conventions with him and, watch kids line up, and he would sign the boxes for them and sit and talk to them about, how he made them and why he made them the way they did. And so for me, there was always in my mind a path to creating the sort of cultural entertainment products that I was excited by. And it seemed like something that was, people did. I recognize that is a very rare and privileged thing to enjoy. But that meant that, like, from 5, 6 years old, every time that I would get into something, I wouldn't just think about how much I enjoyed the product. I would think about how I wanted to make a product like that or participate in the creation of making those products. And, that meant as a 3rd and 4th grader, me and my friends would, draw up, basically like blueprints for video games that we wanted to make, and like sketch out what levels would look like, if you imagine like a side scroller like Mario. And then, by the time we got super into comics, like, everyone wanted to draw comics. And I was, I really thought probably up until I was about 17 that being a comic illustrator was going to be, my career path. And, when I got into high school, some of my friends, got very into, as we all sort of fell in love with rap music. Some of them got very into the idea of making rap music. And, like anyone that likes rap when you're a teenager, you're gonna have kids that like get drunk and freestyle, and,
Right.
Friends that DJ and friends that make beats, and, and
Were you ever that guy?
No, I certainly knew that I had no, I'm not, I'm much better at writing than I am at talking. And I didn't have the sort of sense of improvisation that which is probably surprising listening to me talk here. No, just kidding. But I just never had that ability. And then also, I never grew up playing musical instruments, so my natural sense of rhythm was always fairly limited. So, while I really enjoyed sort of being a part of it, watching my friends excel at this, and I also got into sort of like a lot of the technical side of, when we were making beats, like we did it in the most scrappy way with like a Tascam four-track recorder with, the Gemini sampler. And then eventually we got the Jam Man. And so, I got into kind of like understanding the sort of behind the scenes elements of it, but
got it.
and occasionally I would listen to records and like find breaks and pass them to my friends who are, much more musically gifted than I to, sort of make suggestions. But again, I just didn't have the wherewithal to actually make music. But I did have this interest in being a part of bringing this type of art to the world. And that was kind of the auspice of, getting the internship at Nervous. I was a kid that again was always obsessed with sort of being behind the scenes and being part of whether it was making comics or making rap. And as a young kid, I remember skateboarding over to 325 Park Avenue where Marvel was based in the 80s, and sort of wishing on a star that I'm going to run into Frank Miller and this is going to like yield an internship, and all of a sudden I'm going to be in the Marvel bullpen, which of course didn't. But that's the same urge that whatever 5 years later you know has me picking up the phone book and literally just looking for Nervous Records and being like, oh yeah, I could take the 1 train there and be up there in like 35 minutes. Cool, I'm going to call them and see what happens. And but those experiences were interesting because it did give me sort of more behind the scenes understanding of hip hop than obviously most of my friends or I had certainly before that. But it also really kind of informed me about what I didn't like. And what I didn't like was, one, I saw how contentious the relationship between boot camp and Nervous was. And I sort of realized that, oh, just because these people are like helping bring this art to the world doesn't mean that like everyone's having fun together, which, seems sort of perhaps naive, but when you're 16, you really think like this is all going to be like rainbows and sunshine. And then I get to Priority, and at the time, Priority didn't really have much in terms of music that I really wanted outside of Boot Camp Click and Organized Confusion. And the Organized Confusion album wouldn't come for another, I don't know, 9 months or something like that. And Boot Camp Click more or less operated by themselves. They would slide through the office or whatever, but they pretty much were a self-sufficient organization. And it left me feeling like I still really want to be involved with this, but I want to be involved with it in a much more creative capacity.
Right.
And I also want a role that can sort of give me deeper access to more facets of this universe. And that really led me to, thinking about media and maybe working at magazines because, I had grown up reading The Source starting in 1991 with the end of the year issue. And as I gotten older, things at The Source had changed. I didn't really even, I was not privy to staff changes or any of that kind of stuff, but I just knew that the content was no longer sort of in my aesthetic sweet spot. And I ventured off to reading rap pages and then reading all of these underground zines that were coming out at the time, like Ego Trip and On the Go and Stress, and eventually like Elemental and Elementary and all of these magazines. Nice. And I looked at particularly Ego Trip and On the Go, and I thought that they were just such overwhelmingly creative products that it felt like, they are consuming this culture, but then adding on to the discourse and the conversation around it in a really meaningful way. It's not just, I often think about like the sort of metaphor of like, you have the sun and then you have like reflected light, and like a lot of media outlets are just reflecting the light from the culture, the artists. And then you have some that are actually participants in shaping that culture through the dialogue that they create. And I thought, Ego Trip really had kind of a um, you know, special point of view on the music and the culture. And they were making fundamentally a magazine that, you know, had so much sort of depth to the content. It was giving you, you know, the information about what's coming up, but a level of analysis that was acerbic and biting and funny and deeply knowledgeable and deeply reverent, but also cynical and jaded and hilarious. And, you know, that just sort of resonated with me. And I thought, okay, maybe media is where I can sort of have a place in this, because I love this music. I think about it constantly. I talk about it with my friends constantly. Maybe there's a place for me to be able to make, you know, a print publication. And, you know, and again, this sort of gets back to then tying in the things with growing up reading comics and like, you know, there was something about publications and paper and layouts that I found really, you know, compelling.
What is the sequence of events that happens from you illustrating a Jiggy comic strip to you writing and landing a position of senior editorial assistant at Ego Trip? How does that happen?
So, you know, I had done these internships at the labels during the spring and summer of '96. And then during the fall, I was pretty occupied dealing with like getting into college and all that kind of stuff. And my school, you know, basically because a lot of kids took advanced placement classes, which for whatever weird reason end the first week of May. My school mandated that we all had to get a 6-week internship. So from like May 1st to the middle of June to end our school year. And I thought, you know what? I'm still really, really into this, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly like what my path is. Um, let me try a magazine and see if that's it. And I thought, you know, at the time, the idea of like working at the source seemed almost like too daunting. And also, frankly, my taste had become pretty aberrant from the source at that point. They were, you know, really, you know, this is at this point, there was a lot. I mean, it was a heavily leaning West Coast in its interest, and also, you know, this is sort of when you're getting the schism between quote unquote the underground and like the shiny suit, you know, commercial rap. And and so I thought, all right, you know what, let me try one of these underground zines. One, that seems like I might actually be able to land it. Two, I feel like maybe this is more my tribe, and these I'm going to find some people there that like the same things as I do. And so I sat, you know, literally in my bedroom, and I looked at On the Go, Stress, and Ego Trip, and I thought about like which one really appealed to me most. And, you know, Stress was cool, was never really my thing, but I enjoyed it and I respected it. And On the Go, I thought, was incredibly well done in terms of like the art and the layout, and I love the covers. They were so funny. And then Ego Trip had these incredibly artistic, really well composed covers, fairly rough around the edges, zine style art direction, but in the richest and funniest writing. And, you know, humor has always been something that is really important to me. When I was into comics, I loved Justice League International, which was like you know, a heavily humor-based comic. And I thought, you know, Ego Trip, just like every single page has something that is just so hilarious and so pointed. And I also have no idea, like I don't know what's fake and what's real. That is Ted Bono a real person, or is this all like a joke? Um, you know, the chart, like they'd have like charticles and stuff like that that were all like, again, it was this like incredibly acerbic sense of humor, but it was also predicated on a deep knowledge of the subject matter. And so like I couldn't put an ego trip in front of, some random kid at my high school and expect them to understand the jokes. Because if you don't really know rap music, it's not that funny. But for me, it was like laugh until you cry funny, because it's all of these coded jokes. And again, I really loved, just like when I first got into rap and when I got into comics, like I love the idea of, having a puzzle that you're sort of solving. It's a level of mental engagement that is, I think, really satisfying. And then you add on top of that, laughing until you cry is a great feeling. Like there's not much in the world that feels better than that. And so I just called them, and I called and I called and I called and I called and I called. And after 2 weeks, a woman named Vicky, who was running the ad sales team there, she was the ad sales team there, called me back and brought me in for an interview. And on Valentine's Day, 1997, I sat in this little one-room office on 368 Broadway with Chairman Mao and Gabe Alvarez, and kind of gave them my pitch. And, they invited me in. And I think within like the first week or two, it must have been like the first week, they asked me if I wanted to write, or if I aspired to write. And I said, not really. I like the idea of making magazines, but like, I'm not really a writer beyond writing term papers at this point. And I said, but I am an illustrator, and I'm trying to go to college for that. And they asked me to do a comic called Jiggy, which was basically taking the sort of tropes of Ziggy, a very famous newspaper strip, and then like supplanting some really sort of nuanced, contextual hip hop industry humor on top of it. And of course, I jumped at the opportunity, went home that night, stayed up all night, knocked out a rough one, a rough draft of it. And the guys thought it was funny. I think they had a very sort of punk rock aesthetic. And the fact that my illustrations were pretty crude and not all that good kind of appealed to them. And then they ended up asking me to illustrate a few more things in the issue.
And backing up for a second, not to cut you short, that initial draft you go home to develop, does that change when it gets published in Ego Trip?
No, I mean, basically, I came back to the office with a penciled version of it, and I was like, "What do you guys think?" And they were like, "Great, just finish it." And so I sat in the office that afternoon and inked it with some little Micron pens and gave it to them. And I guess they brought it to the art director, and she scanned it in. And that was sort of the, it was a very DIY operation. Let me tell you that.
Nice.
I joined Ego Trip about, I don't know, 6 weeks before Brent Rollins did. So they had an art director who had done kind of, the first, I don't know, 8 issues or 10 issues or whatever it was. But she was, from what I could tell, at least from being there for her last issue, sort of not as involved in the sort of overall process of making the book. She would sort of take what they gave her and then make it make sense and send it off to the printer. Perhaps she had been involved in the early parts, but by that point it felt like it was kind of like an assembly line. So it was just kind of like, no one there was really weighing in on it. Eventually Brent would join the squad. He would come from Rap Pages probably in like April or early May. And then, the aesthetics of Ego Trip would really come into focus, and he would sort of take the whole, visual identity of the magazine up a notch. And he and I would work incredibly close. I did a lot of the sort of grunt work of, scanning in images, creating bitmaps, color correcting things, anything to kind of free up time so that he could do the actual creative heavy lifting on the book. And then at that point, I would say I felt like I was really sort of part of more of a team flow.
Mercy. Mercy. Ego trip. Ego trip. Mercy. Ego trip. Ego trip.
They were getting ready to ship the this is the Biggie Smalls issue with the red cover where he's in the Chinese restaurant, which was my first issue. And I think Riggs Morales, who was a editor at The Source at the time, had agreed to write a Chub Rock review for them. And for whatever reason, Riggs got caught up at the last minute and couldn't do it. And, it was the 11th hour. The guys were getting ready to ship the thing. And, it was just sort of like one more piece of work that got like washed back up on their shores. And I was standing there when Chairman Mao, I believe, was lamenting a little frustration around having to figure this out in the last minute. And I just said, hey, I could do it. And they were like, all right, you have 24 hours. And I went home and took, all my old copies of The Source and Vibe and Ego Trip and like reread all of my favorite reviews, the ones that had like jumped out to me as particularly awesome. And sort of, constructed a framework of, how do these things actually work structurally, and let me just try to sort of like emulate this. And I'm not going to try to do any like, high diving acrobatics or like get any super great jokes off. Let me just get the car from, A to B without crashing. And so I wrote, I listened to the album and wrote the review. And, thankfully Jeff was a great editor and came in and added, some punchiness to the review. And, that kind of like when the magazine came out and I saw my name there, I got bitten by the bug of like, I think I can do this. And like, again, I spend a probably unhealthy amount of time thinking about rap music and talking about rap music. And here's this vehicle for me to channel that into something that's constructive and potentially entertaining and, for a consumer, and also, an actual contribution to the culture that I'm so, in love with.
Your sex appeal ready for the sweet sperming. Bank accounts all full of interest be earning. Ben Franklin's determined if you get that higher learning. The Million Man March, starring Mark Furman, it can happen. Lyrical Dawn is the charm for the rapping. Gift spliff for Romans cause many fetal comas. No blood donors. I credit diabetics who drink sodas while in the pens lie the roughneck soldiers. What happened? Niggas must have napped. What happened to all of that Malcolm X shit before he got trapped? Before he got capped? When I mean capped, when they put his name on all those cute little Spike Lee hats, and then they say black is back. Where rent? Niggas now only care about the rent and how to pay rent and how they tripe squaw spend. Black Potter knows Land Cruise or Range Rover. Why you running for when you're for running, nigga? Who drove your mind? Your nine spray, my mind spray. The mind. Your nine spray, my mind spray. My mind.
Who were some of the writers whose work you studied for your first review? Who were some of those writers who are still writing today that you studied?
I mean, Chris X was always a big one for me. Sasha Jenkins, of Ego Trip, Elliot Wilson, Chairman Mao, Gabe Alvarez. I remember he wrote a review of Warren G's second album that he said something along the lines of like, admitting that you like Warren G is like admitting to your boy that you still wear pajamas that zip up. with the feet. And I always thought that that was a really hilarious mental picture.
That's great.
And I'm trying to think who else was I really into. Some of the older Source critics, obviously Matty C. The Unsigned Hype was incredibly influential on me.
Yeah.
John Schechter, aka Jay the Sultan. Reef, although I only caught the very tail end of his sort of writing career. And then the Dream Hamptons, the Kevin Powells, Michael Gonzalez, trying to think who, Robert Morales, some of the guys from Vibes stable that I thought were really, really gifted. I mean, there are so many who I sort of learned to appreciate over the years. But those are sort of the core people to me. Really, it was like those early Source people, a few of the big name vibe writers, Joan Morgan, Trisha Rose, and then the Ego Trip guys. I really felt like all five of them wrote on a completely different level. And again, because I felt like, to use sort of it's like, they say like clowns are like the best acrobats. I felt like the way that they were able to layer humor into this very incisive, biting criticism that was still celebratory and not mean-spirited was really a feat and something to aspire towards. Like I said about that little Warren G thing, it's like, because those visuals are those are the things that, like, I think stick with a reader and sort of bounce around in their head, apparently for me 25 years later. And yeah, and again, I just sort of, as with drawing and, every other sort of discipline that I became interested in, it just became like, all right, I'm going to put in my 10,000 hours and see if I can, really make something out of this.
So how does your perspective then change from, learning about yourself with Ego Trip in this creative process? And what did Ego Trip teach you about crystallizing a vision?
Well, I guess I would have to say that the thing that I learned most from Ego Trip as a collective was really about the power of team building and the power of collaboration. Those five guys are all straight up geniuses in their own unique ways. And their geniuses are very complementary to one another. Elliot is incredibly ambitious and incredibly competitive and incredibly driven, and also obsessed with rap music and all rap music, like the good, the bad, the new, the old, things that came out 40 years ago and what's going to come out tomorrow. It doesn't matter. He has an obsessive desire to want to understand and know about it and be immersed in it. Sasha has a very sort of eclectic set of interests and influences, from skating and BMX biking to punk rock music, to sort of like more straight up, rock and roll, to, knowing also tons about hip hop music. And then also, looking at everything through the lens of race and the lens of class, and having this incredible sense of humor. And Chairman Mao is, he has the obsession that Elliot has, except for him, it was always about the production of the music. And so he knows he has this insanely detailed understanding of how the music is made and what is going on and why things that people like are liked, and what is animating and, sort of driving that interest. and he also has an integrity and a sort of a seriousness about everything that he does. And, you know, you can see it in, you know, the interviews that he's done on Red Bull Music Academy with people like Doom, you know, to the Rammellzee exhibit that he curated. Like, he cares so much about making sure that every detail of the art and the process and the artist intent is reflected in whatever it is that he is making. Gabe is absolutely one of the funniest people that I've ever met. And also so deeply into hip hop music, but coming from LA, has a very different sort of perspective and, you know, reference base than the other guys who grew up, you know, in Queens and Boston respectively. But Gabe is like a natural storyteller in a certain way. And he and I would, you know, 25 years later would collaborate on some Cypress Hill comics together. But, you know, he has this ability to mine reality and turn it into fiction in a way that is, you know, certainly beyond my capacity. But he was able to sort of inject a lightness into a lot of what Ego Trip did, and a sort of surreality that I think, you know, drove a lot of the kind of like more absurdist humor that they had in there. And then, you know, Brent is the visualizer of the crew, and he has, you know, this sort of supernatural ability to distill what is interesting about something and then communicate that in a coherent visual language. And, you know, and has his own sort of innate sense of storytelling and sense of humor. And, you know, he and I would work for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years together on Complex. And, you know, those covers are like a dive into the mind of Brent Rollins, and really, you know, represent a conversation and a back and forth and a dialogue between him and me, where a lot of times, you know, he would sort of be pushing me to explain to him why I wanted to put this person on the cover, or what was so interesting about them, or what was their story, or why did it matter. And then he would come back with a visual representation of that. Anyway, having sung all their praises at some length, I got to watch these 5 guys work together seamlessly, and despite being all very, very, very different and motivated by very, very different things, come together to create one product. And, you know, when I say come together to create one product, I mean literally, like, you know, Elliot and Sasha would come to the office at the end of the day, where they worked at Vibe and The Source respectively. And, you know, I would get to sit and watch these 5 guys sit around one computer with Chairman Mao as the hands behind the keyboard. And they would come up with these charts, or write, you know, Ted Bono's editorial, the Teditorial, or Galen Bono's, you know, column, or the Ego Trip fiction. And I imagine it is probably what, like, being in the SNL writers' room in 1977 was like. But it taught me that you have to find your tribe, and you have to find your people who augment you and make you better. And you have to have, you know, sort of like that overlap, shared part of the Venn diagram, where, you know, you guys can find that common ground that the product that you collaboratively make lives in. But in order for that product to really be robust and to really be bulletproof, you need to have all of these sort of complementary but different perspectives, and you have to figure out how to manage them. And again, watching those guys as a 17, 18-year-old was so instructive for how I thought about it. It was a real revelation because, when people talk about art, a lot of times they talk about like, and there's this idea of like some person like going off, into the hills by themselves, and then they like emerge with this amazing, piece of literary fiction or this amazing album, and they like come back down, like Moses with the Ten Commandments. And it's like, sure, there every now and again you have a person like that. You have a Jay-Z, you have an Eminem, someone who can just kind of like be both the alpha and omega of it, but it doesn't have to be like that. And that there is a way to work with other people. And that frankly, if you can make that collaboration work, everyone can have so much fun together. And that was the thing, was I was watching these guys, and I'm 17 and they're probably like 26 or 27, which at the time I thought was like grown and old, which now at 44 is sort of hilarious. But I'm watching them sit around and like tell jokes ostensibly to make each other laugh. And like that is the litmus test. And it's like who can top whoever spoke last, and not in a biting, negatively competitive way, but in a way that like we're all trying to reach for the ceiling, but each one of us is pushing the ceiling higher. And I spent the rest of my career really trying to emulate and recreate that, in my own way. And you can look at Mass Appeal, and you can look at Complex, and you can look at idea generation, and each one of those things is, a different attempt to try to find that magic and that chemistry.
When you think about your contribution to Ego Trip, what is it that you think you brought that changed the perspective of Ego Trip as a magazine and pushed the envelope?
I would not say that I did that at all, to be honest. I think I was fortunate to be in those rooms and to spend time with those guys. And, I think as we've all grown older and matured, I've managed to sort of create meaningful relationships with each of those five guys. And, I would hope, if you were to ask them, they might offer ways in which I have like changed their perspectives or added to how they think about the world. But Ego Trip was their deal. And, I again was so grateful for the opportunity to apprentice myself to them and to contribute to helping them realize their vision. But I wouldn't go as far as saying that I shaped it in any real meaningful way.
The question remains, which MCs will reign? Which ones will gain? How many suckers will feel pain?
Ask yourself the same question.
Do you have a favorite issue of Ego Trip?
Probably the Gangstar issue. That was the one where I really felt like everything was firing on all cylinders. Because, I got there during Biggie, and that was sort of the last of the black and white newsprint issues,
right,
which I thought, there's a really charming DIY quality to them. But, I think all those guys would admit it wasn't necessarily their vision like fully realized. And then, Brent gets there for the Rakim issue. And that was kind of the first time that I think the four other guys realized what an asset having a visual storyteller within their sort of core cipher would be. And so there's like, it's a much more visually dynamic magazine, but I don't think when they went into creating the stories necessarily, they weren't thinking in terms of what the layouts or how the sort of images could complement or make the stories more impactful. And then we all kind of like got that back from the printer. And I think there was a realization of like, oh, okay, here's the things that worked. And here's the things that actually, this magazine is head and shoulders more sophisticated than any of the previous issues. But we're just scratching the surface at this integration between art and content in terms of the storytelling. And then you have the Gangstar issue where I feel like it really came into its own. And of course, the last issue is amazing. But it's always, it's a little bit bittersweet for me because one, it was the last issue. And then also just weirdly as an aesthetics guy, the cover was never my favorite. Like I absolutely love basically every single other one of the covers. That one to me was kind of like cool. When you think about like the Nas cover, I think Danny Clinch shot that. Or the Smith and Wesson, they're in profile and you have sort of this racked focus. Or Ghostface where they're playing with the open aperture in front of the Wu Mansion. Or Redman with the mic hanging so close to his face with the extreme close up. Like all of those, I think are iconic images. Or the way that Brent, took the Rakim photo, which was a little soft in the focus, and like, did the overlay of the text and the spray paint, and then the contrast of the blues and the purples in the photo and the red on the spray paint. All of those, I don't know. For me, I just thought those are like iconic, indelible images. Yeah. The last one is like, it's cool.
You're talking about covers that stopped time back then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we had so much less access to, hip hop and to, so I mean, celebrity in general, of course, but as far as I was concerned, to rap celebrities in specific. And
right.
So, I think that there was a real effort both on the part of the magazines and on the part of the musicians to really make the most of these moments. And, also there was, the economics of print publishing were very different from the economics of, digital media and the sort of race to the bottom. So there was, even at a very DIY scrappy place like Ego Trip, there was there were resources to make these sort of iconic images. And you had, again, the buy-in from the musicians because they were excited to do that.
So you leave Ego Trip in 98 at a time when there's a big turning point for when visuals started to change in hip hop. And labels like Bad Boy are thinking about not just what artists were going to sound like, but also what they would look like. Can you talk about the impact that signified culturally?
I think that, hip hop has been in constant flux. And I think in, its earliest or earlier period, you were seeing a change that was happening very fast and very furiously. And I think that the change that happens in sort of 96 to 98, via Bad Boy, is certainly looked at as a inflection point. And I think perhaps people think of it in an outsized way because the music was really starting to permeate sort of the mainstream at that point. But I mean, as a person that had been following hip hop since, the late 80s, really, if you look at from 86 to 96, the music is changing every 12 to 18 months. And you have, people like Kwame goes from, being a modestly but solidly successful artist in 1990, 1991 to being a punchline in a Biggie song in 1994. And you have groups like Brand Nubian, going from having like a super positive outlook on the world and colorful aesthetic and, being styled in dashikis, to wearing combat boots and baggy jeans and, making pass the gat and punks jump up to get beat down. And so I say that to say, like, the music was constantly evolving. I think that what happened in 96, 97, 98 was really like a bifurcation of the scene where you had sort of the quote unquote mainstream commercial rap and the underground. And the commercial rap was aspiring to exist in a world, alongside, pop music, and, on MTV. And the underground rejected that, and wanted to make rap for people that, were sort of steeped in, the cultural context of rap. And yeah, I mean, I think, that was a big shift. But again, I think, I had been there when, like, Naughty by Nature and Tribe Called Quest and Cypress Hill were sort of at the center of the locus. And then, 2 years later, everything has moved to the West Coast, and now Death Row is, sort of quote unquote running the scene aesthetically. And then 2 years later, Biggie has, taken it back, and him and Puff are redefining what is cool and popular. So, I don't necessarily think it was an aberration as much as it was kind of just a cycle that happened to be that was happening on an increasingly large snowball, if that makes any sense.
Let's take it back to the streets, mother.
Yeah, I'm right here, dog.
Where my dogs at?
We right here, dog.
Where my dogs at?
I'm right here, dog.
What must I go through to show you shit is real? And I ain't really never gave a fuck how niggas feel. Rob and I steal, and cause I want to, cause I have to. And don't make me show you with the Mac. If you don't know by now, then you slip. I'm on some bullshit that's got me jacking niggas flipping. Let my man in them stay pretty, but I'm gonna stay shitty. Cruddy, it's all for the money. Is you with me? Get the bitches, now commit the crime. And when it's on, we transform like Optimus Prime. Out on the head, roll out, let's make it happen. If we ain't gon' get it with this, we'll take it cap. Bustin' off, dustin' off, the softest niggas. Money with the biggest mouth, yo, let's off this nigga. Come on, this nigga, never made a sound. Breathe too fucking hard and he getting bust down.
Yeah, y'all niggas wanna be killers.
Get at me, dog.
Y'all niggas wanna fill us.
Get at me, dog.
Y'all niggas want the bread.
Get at me, dog.
So I worked at Ego Trip during the summer of during the spring of 97. And as I graduated high school, I went, sort of hat in hand to Sasha. And, knowing that Ego Trip was not going to be in a position to give me a summer job, but explaining, all right, I'm about to graduate high school and I'm going to NYU in the fall, but I need to get a summer job. Hey, do you know anybody that might be hiring? Or, is there something that I can do that's like at least adjacent to kind of, what I've been doing at Ego Trip, and I'm thinking, I know Sasha sort of knows Mike D, and maybe he can help me get a clerk job at the XL clothing store, extra large clothing store over on whatchamacallit, Lafayette Street, or something along those lines. And Sasha's like, yeah, actually, my guy Dave Bree just took over the fact-checking department at Vibe, and he needs to hire a new fact checker. I'll vouch for you, but you just got to do me a favor and, like, look, Dave will not be in on it, but you got to just front like you're 20 years old, because they're not going to hire a 17-year-old at Vibe. And I went and met with Dave Bree, rest in peace. And we went and got ham sandwiches and around the block from Vibe, and he explained to me what a fact checker was, and I sort of expressed my interest in the culture and gave him a sense of I guess, the breadth of my knowledge about hip hop and just broadly about music. And he was like, all right, look, I'm going to give you a shot to do this. Please don't make me look bad. If Sasha says you're good money, then, you're good. So, I went and worked that summer between high school and college at Vibe. And while I was there, I got an opportunity to write, maybe one or two clips during the summer. And perhaps most importantly, I met a gentleman named Jesse Washington, who the following year would become the editor-in-chief of Blaze, which was Vibe's brand new or then brand new rap magazine. And I met Jesse, and I knew that he was sort of like a bedroom DJ who would like sort of, do parties for his friends and that kind of thing. And during that summer, the group Lord Tariq and Peter Guns, who at the time were just two guys from Money Boss Players, put out a 12-inch on a piece of red, white label vinyl that just said Deja Vu. And I heard it at Fat Beats one morning and thought it was phenomenal, and just brought it in and was like, Jesse, you're going to love this song. You need to hear this. And he had a turntable in his office. He listened to it. It was like, oh shit, this is crazy. And a year later, he calls me up in the spring of 1998 and is like, hey man, I'm starting this new thing called Blaze. It's going to be like sort of Vibes version of The Source. And I'm putting together my team. Do you want to be an editorial assistant on the launch issue? We're going to start in earnest, I think in May. And I was like, awesome. Yeah. I was like, sure, Jesse, like what made you think of that? And he's like, yo, you put me onto that Lord Tariq and Peter Guns record. That shit is like blowing up everywhere now. You were like 9 months in front of that. I need that kind of ear on the staff. And he let me get down with Blaze, and Blaze was a really incredible experience. I learned a ton, and it's weird. It is sort of been memory hold in the annals of rap. But Blaze had a lot of crazy, chaotic, dramatic moments. But we also made a bunch of really awesome magazines. And I think really added on to the dialogue at the time.
What were some of those crazy and dramatic moments you speak of?
Well, the first was when we were putting the first issue to bed. One of the things that Jesse had wanted to do to sort of differentiate the magazine from our competitive peers was he wanted to engage the artists with the reviews, which was an idea that was very ambitious, and I think some people on the staff thought a little crazy. But he was committed and thought that this was going to really sort of like engender more dialogue within the the artist community, and offer them a platform to respond to criticism, and also give the readers, the sense of satisfaction of knowing that the critique that was levied at the record actually did get back to the artist. I think the cynical take would kind of be like, well, when you spend 2 years making a piece of art and someone tells you they think it stinks, like, how are you supposed to respond to that? Or like, how many different ways can you respond to that? Like, either you're going to be pissed off and tell them that they have no fucking idea what they're talking about, or you're going to like be fake humble and try to like view it as a constructive thing and be quietly upset about it, or you're just going to be like deeply hurt, which, all of which are sort of like, I think that's about the spectrum of reasonable responses you could ask from like a, highly sensitive, probably very insecure artist about, having put this body of work into the world and getting this feedback. Or the review is going to be overwhelmingly positive, and then they're just going to say that they love the review, which of course you love a review in which someone, says you're great. But it was a novel idea and we tried it. And in that first issue, the lead review was the artist Cannabis, who at the time was, incredibly anticipated. He was coming off of a, run of mixtape appearances on Clue. Just every freestyle was crazier, longer, more jaw dropping than the last. And he had linked up with Wyclef Jean of the Fugees. And, we were all kind of like incredibly curious to see what, here's this like just rabid battle rapper with the musical guy from the Fugees. What is this possibly going to sound like? And of course, the album was, I think, pretty universally agreed upon to be underwhelming and not what fans were looking for. And the review had reflected that. And so in the 11th hour, right before we put the issue to press, I guess Jesse and the music editor Dowie went to sit with Cannabis and Clef to, I guess, read them their review and get their reaction. And the reaction was not good, according to the editorial that Jesse published in that first issue. Wyclef pulled a gun on him and threatened him. And he, Jesse turned this into the sort of animating, narrative for his launch issue editorial. Kind of used it, I think, as a narrative device to talk about how what we were doing was different and confrontational and exciting, et cetera, et cetera. But as you can imagine, this was extremely controversial and, made news and was picked up by tabloids as well as MTV News. And Wyclef, I believe, first denied it and made a sang a song on MTV News trying to say that like basically Jesse was clout chasing to sell magazines, but then privately admitted it to some Rap Pages editor who then told MTV News, and then that ran. So this was like several news cycles of gossip fodder. But that was pretty crazy. Then a few months later, we, quite by accident, and I say by accident because we didn't know that it was even a secret, revealed who the Mad Rapper was. That the Mad Rapper was Derek D. Angeletti. And he and some of his associates came to the office asking to speak to whoever was responsible for this. And Jesse, being a mensch and being the guy in charge, agreed to go meet them in the conference room to talk about it. And I believe, they assaulted him with a chair, and he ended up suing them and walking away with some money. But that was also a really crazy moment. I definitely remember, like, I think I got to the office immediately after Jesse had been taken to the hospital. And, as you can imagine, everyone was quite shaken up by this. And also really quite mystified because, like I said, going into this, none of us had thought that the identity of the Mad Rapper was a secret. And so we had put in some article like the Mad Rapper, and then we put in parens like Derek D. Angeletti. And again, with no malice or feeling that we were like, letting the cat out of the bag. It was, if you were in the industry and you heard D. talk, you knew his voice, and it was obviously him. And then the third time was about a year after that. We were working on an issue of Blaze, and there was a young man who had recently come on as an intern that Jesse knew from his time in Yale, up in New Haven. The dude was from Harlem, I believe, and he had recently gotten out of jail. And I was kind of unfamiliar exactly with the details, but I understood that he had been exonerated from a murder charge that he had done a couple years on, but through the appeal process, it was proven that he was not responsible for this. And so Jesse writes an editorial for Blaze about the criminal justice system and wrongful imprisonment, and how this gentleman is turning over a new leaf, and this is sort of, I think, exemplifies Jesse's personal commitment to social justice as well as Blaze's. Now, the murder that he was exonerated for was the son of Gerald Levine. Gerald Levine was the CEO of Time Warner. Time Warner had been the owner of Vibe. Gerald Levine had sold Vibe to a gentleman named John Miller, I believe. Miller Publishing owned Vibe and Blaze. So this editorial somehow ends up moving through the company up to the, to the top, to the tippy top. And there's an objection made by the ownership. And I don't really know the details of this because I was 19 and I was not privy to everything that was going on. But my understanding was that Jesse was told, you can't run this editorial in the magazine. Bob looks at Gerald like that's his big brother or his mentor, and him and the family reject the court's ruling on this kind of thing, and they're not comfortable with this, and Bob's not comfortable with this, and so Jesse rightfully stood on his ground and said, no, this is the right thing to do, both just objectively, this is the morally correct thing to do. The kid was exonerated. He did years of time on the wrong charges, and everyone feels bad for the situation, and we all obviously hope that that justice is served, and that the real perpetrators of this crime are found. But the courts have ruled, and he has been found innocent beyond a reasonable doubt. Right. And that was not well received by the ownership, and essentially he was unwilling to change things, and they fired him, and it ended in a very cataclysmic back and forth. I remember, I basically I'm coming up from NYU, and I get on the elevator there, and there's one of the sort of C-suite guys from the Vibe, from Miller Publishing is on there, and I sort of make eye contact. He knows who I am from just seeing me around the Vibe office, and he's got these three big dudes in suits that look like Men in Black kind of thing. And again, I've sort of known that this is a controversy that's been going around, and then Jesse has talked to the staff about it, and we all kind of agree with him and have his back. But I sort of assumed this would come to some diplomatic solution. And I go walk in, these gentlemen leave the elevator, I go drop my book bag off, and the next thing I know, I hear they're screaming. I come running out of my little cubicle. I see a turntable go flying through the air and land in a wall. And eventually Jesse ends up being escorted out. And we are told that he is no longer an employee of the company, and we're not allowed to talk to him anymore. As you can imagine, this is a young staff. I'm 19 at the time. most of the rest of the people on the team are, in their early 20s, and we are all just beside ourselves. Mimi
Head
Valdez,
blown.
who was the managing editor and would become the next editor-in-chief, is, crying and trying to sort of like hold the rest of the unit together. We end up meeting, and I feel like a few days later, Jesse swung by the office, and although he wasn't allowed in the office, we all went downstairs and kind of like talked to him on the street. And, he was sort of like, guys, like, basically, I appreciate that you all ride for me, and I appreciate that you all, think that I'm in the right, but like, these are your jobs, and like, I don't expect you to all like bounce on account of, this situation. And, we were, Mimi ended up being elevated and becoming editor-in-chief and taking over. And yeah, things kept on moving. And, I think through all of that, I it's hard to even wrap my head around all of the lessons that I learned in, those multiple incidents. But suffice to say, I grew up a lot as a professional, and whatever rose-colored glasses still remained on my on my face after, a couple of years in this industry, that really ripped them off. And I understood exactly what this was.
That's insane. Pretty incredible. What a story, man. What a story.
Also crazy. You know who else was in the office when that happened? Tragedy Gaddafi.
No way, of all people.
Yeah, I just remember seeing him like while all this melee is happening, and I'm standing there, and like, dudes are fighting and shit is crazy. I just see like Trad stick his head out from the hallway, like, oh, y'all really crazy up in here. I was just like, what? Yeah, that was a crazy time. And after that, Blaze sort of like found its footing. And I think, to Mimi's credit, she did her best to kind of like, shake off all of the dramas and find a new creative focus for the book, and, turn it into something, that had its own lane. Unfortunately, Vibe would actually end up pulling the plug about a year later, in the spring of 2000, right when I was finishing up finals at NYU. I remember coming up to the office and just like opening the door, and everyone just looking shell-shocked and being like, "Hey, so it's over." It's like, oh, Jesus Christ. Just when I thought we were catching a vibe.
No pun intended.
Yes, no pun intended.
In terms of Vibe pulling a plug, what were those moments like leading up until that point? I'm curious as to, was there an issue that helped you, I guess, establish a sense of where you wanted to go and what you wanted to do at Blaze?
I mean, I think that I learned the most, again, like so much of what I learned was really just watching the grown-ups around me operate and seeing how they moved. And, I got from, Jesse was an incredible leader, and like, nobody on the staff worked harder than Jesse. And that was, I thought, left a really, really remarkable impression on me. Mimi brought a sort of canny to the positioning of the book that, would really inform how I thought about running Complex. The first year at Blaze, we really earnestly tried to go head to head with the source. And honestly, mostly to a series of losses. And we had, at that point in any given month, there was this really one, incredibly hot rapper who demanded, the attention of a cover. And, the source was a legacy publication in the space at that point. And we would, again and again and again, just lose out to the source. And if you look at those first year Blaze covers, we basically had the artists that appeared on the source's covers, but a couple months or a month after the source had them. And, you know, when Mimi got there, I think she saw an opportunity in shifting the focus of the book forward and leaning into, 1998 had a incredible sort of emergent class of new artists. And, where the source had done like I remember this in the spring of 98, they did like a group cover that had like DMX and Corrupt and maybe the Locks and Nori or something like that. It was like 7 artists. And Mimi's take was like, well, if all those artists can only share a cover at the source, what if we just lean in on the ones that we think are really going to break? And all of a sudden, we started doing a Beanie Siegel cover and a Lil Wayne cover and a Trina and Trick Daddy cover. And that was really where Blaze started to find its own voice and its own space within the culture. And, combine that with the art director, Mark, really coming into his own. Him and a woman named Sarah Friedman ended up shooting a lot of our covers. And so the book got a real visual identity that was very punchy and poppy, and I think fit within the sort of aesthetic language that had been established by people like Hype Williams in kind of music videos of the time. And then, we just, we took these gambles on emergent young artists, and, they might not have had the splash of having, sort of the biggest power hitter at any given moment, but it made Blaze sort of a complementary read that didn't try to compete to be the source, but offered you a totally different experience. And our sales went up through that, I think, because, we ended up getting a lot of people who bought the source who would also buy Vibe. And then also a bunch of, a sort of younger demographic that was interested in, didn't care about people who had been a star 4 years ago. Because if you're in high school, someone who was famous 4 years ago was famous when you were, 10. And that's, they seem like old news to you. And so, yeah, watching that, I really, I would utilize a lot of that when I stepped into the, hot seat at Complex.
What's going on? If you are still listening to this episode and enjoying the podcast, why not become a patron of Fly Fidelity at patreon.com/flyfidelity. Becoming a patron means you are directly supporting our show and helping us to create a new episode each and every week. It also means that as a thank you for being a super supporter, you'll be able to access exclusive content to you, including patron updates, offers and discounts, a monthly secret podcast, early access, and so much more. What about your memories of featuring Eminem in Blaze? What's the story behind that?
Well, in that period, I was just a underground rap nerd that was going out to, every showcase at, the New Eurekan Poets Cafe or the Cooler or SOBs or whatever. And then on the weekends, I would go hang out at Fat Beats. Just the way I used to go sit around comic stores, in my adolescence. I was friends with Max Glazer, who was the DJ at Fat Beats, and my friend Alina was working the register there at the time. And so like Saturday mornings, I would just go in there, check out the new records that they had stocked, drink a coffee, eat a bagel, and, just sort of like hang out. And one Saturday afternoon in probably like May of '98, a very tall gentleman walked in and started talking to Max Glazer. And, I'm just sitting with Alina bullshitting. And all of a sudden over the PA system, I hear what would, the record that is My Name Is for the first time. And I'm like, the voice instantly is recognizable to me. And I'm like, this is the kid from Detroit, the white rapper, that kid Eminem, but he sounds really different. He's like super high pitched instead of like this like bass nasal voice. And I walk over to the tall gentleman who would be Paul Rosenberg. And I'm like, hey, is this Eminem? And he's like, yeah, this is the new Eminem. We just signed a deal. I'm his manager. No, actually, he was like, I'm his lawyer. We just signed a deal with Dr. Dre. He's going to be on Aftermath. And him and Dre got in the studio recently, a few weeks ago. And this is the first record that they made. And he played My Name Is, he played Guilty Conscience, and he played Role Model. And I was absolutely blown away. I had really liked the Just Don't Give a Fuck single, and thought that it was novel and that the lyrics were funny and catchy. But it was like a decidedly underground record with a pretty modest ceiling in my mind. And these Dre records were just so big. And also, you have to understand, this is a time where Dr. Dre is kind of walking off a misfire with The Firm. And so these are the first time that we're hearing the sound that would become the new Dre sound. And it's like, holy shit, this sounds, it's huge, it's big, it's musical, and it's not G-Funk. It sounds like boom bap rap, but done on this like really expansive scale. And I ran to the Blaze office on Monday morning, and I told Jesse and a gentleman named Daryl Dawsey about it. And they were like, all right, Dr. Dre's the man. He kind of missed with those last two records with the Firm and the Aftermath album, but you can't really count that guy out. So Paul and Drew Haw came up to the office and played, I don't know, 6 or 7 M records, and those guys were sold. I was not lying. And the next week I got on a flight to Burbank, California, and met up with M and spent about a week shadowing him as he was mixing the Slim Shady LP.
Incredible. And you're with Royce at the same time, right?
Yeah, it was him and Royce. I obviously had no idea who Royce was at the time, but literally I pulled up in this like strip mall where they had their studio in Burbank. And as I'm walking to the studio, I hear there's like a rental car that is blasting music, like incredibly loud. The bass is like rumbling. And as I get closer, I realize I can hear the vocals and that this is M's voice. And I look in, and M and Royce are sitting, in the driver's seat and shotgun. And so I knock on the window and I explain who I am, and they're like, oh shit, yeah, we're just mixing these records. And M explains that he likes to listen to everything in the car because, basically he finds that like things sound one way on studio speakers, on monitors, and then you get them in a car and they sound totally different. So he was like, I never close out a mix session without taking it into the car. So they invite me, and I was actually with Max Glazer at the time. He was out there doing another story for Blaze with DJ Revolution. And we sat in the back seat and listened to As the World Turns, and our jaws hit the floor.
And as we go along, throughout the days of our lives, we all face small obstacles and challenges every day that we must go through. These are the things that surround us through our atmosphere every day. Every single day, the world keeps turning, keeps turning.
pretty aggressive content. And it definitely, you know, I was like, holy shit, I can't believe the things this guy is saying. And yeah, and I spent about a week kind of just shadowing him, you know, as he worked on that stuff. And sort of put the finishing touches on that record. It was incredible though. Every now and again, I've had experiences in this as a journalist where I know that I am witnessing history as it's happening, and spending that time with M and Royce, I knew it instantly. And I came home and I wouldn't shut up about, you know, how he was about to be the biggest thing in the world. And, you know, to remember, this is like in 1998, there is a very bad taste in everyone's mouth about the idea of a white rapper. You know, Vanilla Ice has ruined this for absolutely everybody. The idea of a white rapper being even like credible is a bit of a stretch. And the idea of a white rapper crossing over and being commercially successful is more or less unthinkable. And I come back and I'm just like, yo, look, no one wants to be championing this less than me, the 19-year-old white kid that, you know, is on the team. Like, but I'm telling you, like, whatever the thing is that Dr. Dre did when he took Snoop Dogg and made Doggy Style, like he did that with this guy. And these records they're lyrical, they're clever, they're funny, they're interesting, and they all knock. I think this is going to be a thing. I remember one of my friends at NYU, like literally just to shut me up, bet me $100 that M wouldn't go gold.
Really?
I wish that I still had that check, because he definitely did write me a $100 check about 10 months later. But yeah, I mean, it was just, and it was incredible. And again, like, it is one of those few moments where you know that you are witnessing history as it unfolds, and, you know, getting to sort of like sit in it. It was an unbelievable experience.
Make sure you tune in next week for part 2 of our conversation with Noah, in which we discuss his run with Stimulated Records, Mass Appeal, Complex, Def Jam, and so much more, including Idea Generation.
I wish I could show my appreciation for this
podcast.
I wish I could respond to it somehow, or be notified in the future when
Fly Fidelity
updates, because it's so great. But I don't think there's a way I can do any of those things.
Uh-oh. You're wrong.
Subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and never miss an episode. Find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook.
My peoples, are you with me where you at?